In this Shadow of the Erdtree video, I'm going to be showing you my Void Knight build. This is a build that not only uses the Armor of Night, but also uses the Sword of Night and the Shield of Night. You can find the sword by doing Count Ymir's quest line and progressing it all the way to its end or close to the end of it, and the Armor of Night and Shield of Night are found in Bonnie Jail, which is not too far into the game. If you go through the Morth Ruins, come out the other side, run a little ways, you can find this little dungeon, and it's up there. Taking the jar up, and you can get these two things really quickly. So let's talk about the katana first before we get into the shield. So the katana itself is pretty standard for katana. It's got blood loss buildup on it. It has dex scaling. It's a unique katana, so you can't infuse it or anything like that. It has pretty good dex scaling, has physical and magic damage with the vast majority of it being physical, and it has a unique weapon skill called Witching Hour Slash. What this weapon skill does is it kind of holds the katana out to the side and then does a 3-hit slash really quickly and kind of advances the character forward and has a lot longer range than the katana itself. Kind of reminds me of Rivers of Blood in that way. You're going to hit much further than the weapon itself. Additionally, you can charge this up for increased range and damage, and it takes a lot longer to use it, but if you can predict when you're going to have a window, like if you stagger a boss or an enemy, or if you know an enemy is advancing at you at a good speed, you can charge it up and get some extra range and damage. And one thing I really like about this skill, compared to some other skills, is that while you're charging it, if you realize the enemy's going to make it to you or hit you before you can fully charge, you just let go and the skill fires off. So there is a little wiggle room in there that if you mistime it a little bit, you can still get at least the base version off. There are a few downsides to this weapon besides the fact that it can take you a little bit to acquire, which are that it's not very long for a weapon. It has very short reach, especially if you're used to using something like the Naga Kiba or even using the Great Katana or something like that. It's going to seem quite short, so you're going to have to get used to that, even though the weapon skill itself has quite long range. And the next thing is the FP cost of this skill is a bit high. 21 is pretty high for a weapon skill that will kill one enemy effectively, right? Like if you use this on one enemy, it'll basically kill a regular enemy. So 21 FP to kill a regular enemy versus some other weapon skills that use like 12 or 13 FP to kill a regular enemy is, pretty high. So managing your FP becomes an issue when using this weapon. And then the last real negative is quite obvious, which is that you're locked into the animation once the skill fires, and there are a lot of aggressive bosses and enemies in this game. And if you mistime it, you're going to get destroyed. So you have to learn boss attack patterns, I find, and then you can use this weapon skill effectively. But if you're going into a boss blind and you've never fought it before, it can be quite difficult to use this weapon skill. So next, let's take a look at Shield of Night. This is an interesting shield because it weighs almost nothing. It has attack power, physical, and magic, and it has terrible defenses except magic and terrible guard boost, but scales with dexterity and has a unique skill on it called Revenge of the Night. And what this skill does is it, by default, if you press L2, it shoots out a projectile that does modest damage at modest range. It's not very much damage at all, but it costs very low FP. It's 5 FP, but it gives you a ranged option being a melee character, which is quite nice. And the magic that it deals is 100% magic damage, which allows you to boost it easily. And also, it scales with dexterity, so the more dexterity you have, the more magic damage this skill will do. However, what the real intention of this skill is to catch magical projectiles or ranged projectiles and then quickly L2 afterward, almost like a block counter. If you were like block countering a regular melee attack with your shield, you'd hit R2. But in this case, you hit L2 and it'll fire a powered up projectile back at that character. You can do this off melee attacks as well. And a lot of times it'll actually outperform the damage that you do with a block counter. So if you like doing block counters, then, you might want to use L2 instead. But really what you're using it for is to catch ranged projectiles and then send it back at the target, doing insane damage. It does way more damage when it's charged up like this, like 4 times the damage it would normally do. And this often one-shots enemies that are trying to range you down. So it's very situational. You can use it in some boss fights that throw projectiles. You can use it in situations where enemies are ranging you to give you a ranged option, but you won't use it all the time. However, the guard boost and physical protection of this shield are not good enough in order to use this as like a traditional block counter shield. Like you're not going to just run up to enemies, let them attack into your shield, and then block counter, because you're going to drain tons of stamina, take a lot of damage, and you could have just used your weapon skill or ranged them with a weapon skill from afar. I would suggest if you like the style of this and you were looking for a shield to match that you can actually do regular block counters with, that you consider the Mesmer Soldier Shield. This also has a nice look that matches this set really well. So what I do then is I just swap back and forth between two-handing my katana and sword and shielding it depending on what I'm facing, and sometimes during boss fights, I'll even swap back and forth depending on what I think the boss is going to do. Obviously, this is a lot easier to do when you know boss attack animations, much more difficult if you're fighting a boss for a first time. So for armor, I'm actually using the chest piece and helmet of the knight set, and then I have the black knight set on the legs and gloves. And the reason I've done this is that the poise on the armor of knight set is very low. I think it's like 26 total when you're wearing it, 26 or 29, something very, very low like that. But by putting the black knight gauntlets and black knight legs and then putting the bullgoat's talisman, I was able to get over the 51 poise hurdle there. And that's really important because when you're using the weapon skill of the katana, if you get hit and knocked out of that animation, it's going to suck. So you definitely want to have 51 poise. And I did the gloves and legs here. That way I still kind of have the general look of the armor of knight with the helmet and the very recognizable chest plate. But you kind of don't notice as much that I'm wearing a different set on the legs and gloves. Other talismans that you can use for this build. I like Crusade Insignia when you're out on the landscape or you're in a dungeon and you're exploring. This is a really good one for that because you kill enemies regularly. It's going to boost the damage of your attacks, your weapon skill, your shield skill if you're using the projectile to boost the damage of that. So it's just good all around. I also like Shard of Alexander for this build because you're using Witching Hour Slash and Revenge of the Night. It'll boost the damage of both those, so that's really good. And then there are a couple other options you can go with depending on what talismans you have and what you like. I have the Blessed Blue Dew Talisman slotted here, and I find this is better for exploration than when I'm in a boss fight. Because when you're out exploring, it takes time to explore, and what this is going to do is regenerate your FP slowly over time, allowing you to use both of these weapon skills more often and kind of offset some of that high cost of Witching Hour Slash. However, when you're in a boss fight, it just doesn't regenerate quickly enough, in my opinion. You're still going to have to flask. You might get one more use of it off before you have to flask, or maybe two, but you're still going to have to flask, so it's really not going to prevent you from doing it there. I suggest swapping it out during boss fights. Talismans you can use also, Godfrey Icon, you can charge up Witching Hour Slash, so that will increase the damage of that. Highly recommend doing that if you find yourself using the charged up version in a boss fight or on the landscape a lot. Just keep in mind that, if you don't have any way to mitigate FP costs, then you're going to be chugging blue flasks quite regularly. And you can also use Millicent's Prothesis or Rotten Wing Sword Insignia. Both of those are good choices for this build and during boss fights. I don't think they're as good in exploration because you don't tend to get from one enemy to the next that quickly, which is a few seconds before the attack power starts to go down. So I would definitely recommend using Crusade Insignia over Rotten Wing Sword Insignia or Millicent's Prothesis while you're exploring and then swapping during a boss fight. And one thing I want to note too is that I tried to curve Sword Talisman on the sort of block counter animation of Revenge of the Night. It doesn't seem to improve its damage, so don't use that if you're trying to make a build revolving around Revenge of the Night. When I first started putting this build together, I tried to figure out how to min-max Revenge of the Night in order to get very, very high damage on it. And what I just found is that because it has such bad mitigations, you're not going to block anything other than projectiles most of the time. Ideally, that's what you're doing. You see a projectile coming, you block it, you fire off the response, and you kill whoever shot at you, and you take a little bit of chip damage. That's best case scenario with the shield most of the time, or in a boss fight, you catch a projectile, take a little bit of chip damage, and then fling back something that does damage. You're not really going to use it regularly. Even the regular version before it's charged up does so little damage that there's really not a lot of point using it if you're not charging it up. So attribute-wise for this build, I have 55 Vigor, 25 Mind, 27 Endurance, 11 Strength, 80 Dexterity, 16 Intelligence, 7 Faith, and 9 Arcane. You don't need any Intelligence, Faith, or Arcane for this build. My Intelligence is from being an astrologer. This weapon originally had Intelligence scaling before the Day 1 patch. However, it doesn't currently, so you don't need any Intelligence at all. Then Strength only needs to be 11 to meet the requirements of the weapon, unless you're only using it when you're two-handing, and then you don't even need that much. But it's good to have 11 here. That's not very high. Most classes need a point or two, and they can use this one-handed. Vigor is pretty standard for the DLC, between 50 or 60, somewhere in there. Mind is 25. I wish this were higher at this point. You do use a lot of FP with this build, so I'd highly recommend, if you are leveling up past level 150, which is kind of about the level I am in this build, that you put more points into Mind, like 10 more points or so. That'll make using this build a lot easier. Endurance is 27 for this build. This is also a little on the low side, not because of the equip weight, but because of stamina. More stamina is good. I find this is just enough stamina, even without 2 Turtle Talisman or, the tier in my flask that gives stamina recovery. It's still just enough, but having a little bit more, like 30, 35 endurance would probably be better. And of course, dexterity is at 80 here to get max damage from both the weapon and the shield. And this weapon only scales with dexterity, so in order to get more damage out of this build, you'd have to take dexterity up to max. And for Flasks of Wondrous Physique, you can go a couple ways. The Magic Shroud and Cracked tier is fantastic. If you know you're going to be using Revenge of the Night regularly, it really boosts the damage of it. So if you're in an area where there are a lot of enemies ranging you, consider using it there. Or if you're in a boss fight where they throw a lot of projectiles, that might be a good time to have that slotted. Otherwise, you'll probably want to use the Thorny Cracked tier for damage on repeated attacks, since Witching Hour Slash and regular attacks with the katana will build this up, and the Opaline Hard tier for increased protection. For Great Runes here, you could either use Millennias in order to gain health back when attacking if you've just been hit, because we play pretty aggressively with this build. I trade damage a lot. You'll see that in this footage. Or you could go something like Redans for more health, more FP, and more stamina. Again, this build is a little on the FP and stamina low side compared to where I'd rather have it, so those are good, and obviously you can't really go wrong with more health. So that wraps up the Void Knight build. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. Really love the armor style of this and the weapon style. Looks really cool. It's fun to play. You know, don't believe the haters out there. This weapon is really, really good if you use it properly. As always, if you have further tips or questions, please leave them in the comments and I will try and get to them as soon as I can.